Ukraine's former chief of staff and commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine between 2014 and 2019, exposes, reveals all the costly mistakes Ukraine has done in its war against Russia. And he does this without filters. So I wanted to share with you this article published by Texty.org that was published in December 2024. It's an interview with General Viktor Muzhenko. Right off the bat, he says that he doesn't believe it's time to say that Ukraine is losing and that they still have chances on the battlefield. It's okay, I think we can forgive him. It's the little disclaimer before he just exposes everything. Interestingly, he says that one of the mistakes happened in the first days of the war, with this massive wave of volunteers signing up into the army. He says the fact that there was a constant influx of people at the time created a problem for the future. Listen up, he says, some commanders imagined that the human resources were inexhaustible, not realizing that our population was limited, that there was a massive migration of people, and that there would be many unfit for service. And he ends by saying, that is, there would come a time when replenishing the army would become a problem. This is exactly what we're witnessing right now. According to the latest data I've had access to, it's at least 1 million Ukrainian males between 18 to 60 that left the country. At least. It's probably more by now. And like I always say, the problem of the Ukrainian army is that it's still a Soviet army but without access to Soviet resources and Soviet manpower. And since they had so many volunteers, they didn't start mobilizing people right away when motivation was still there, when there was still this patriotic feeling in the country where people wouldn't mind being mobilized. They only started mobilizing when things didn't go as well on the battlefield. But in a way, by that time, it was already too late. Here he talks about another mistake, and I think it's very interesting because it comes from inside the headquarters. He was not active duty, but he saw everything that unfolded. He says the losses in the first few days of the large-scale aggression amounted to about the same amount as in 2014. So this is extremely interesting. I went on ualosses.org, and for the year 2014, they recorded about 2,000 soldiers. KIA for Ukraine. So imagine you're the president, you're the chief of staff of the armed forces of Ukraine, and you constantly get these reports of casualties. And from what he says, the Ukrainians lost 2,000 KIA in the first few days alone. Then he says that he brought this information to the chief of the general staff, and he had many witnesses around him. And after this discussion, he says, then they started to hide these statistics. That's why we didn't have any reports from the Ukrainian side anymore. But it's interesting because it also goes to show the shock that it must have been for the Ukrainian political and military hierarchy. And in my opinion, this could explain why they started negotiations right away, because they got scared. Put yourself in their shoes. They already lost 2,000 soldiers within a couple of days, and they're like, what is it going to be like in 2 months? What's funny is that the Russians probably thought the same thing at the same time. And that's probably why both sides just decided to negotiate. So another problem he talks about is the issue of fortifications. So in March, he went to Donbass and said that trenches and fortifications were not adequate. And he wanted to prepare the country for better defensive positions. But the general he talked to only said, prepare orders, we will attack, we won't defend. Then he says, I called one of the chiefs who was responsible for engineering support. Muzhenko tells the journalist, the tractor bulldozer is one thing, but you still need to dig because a trench saves soldiers' lives. One of the main tools of the infantry is a shovel, a small sapper shovel, a big one, it doesn't matter. Overall, my understanding from this part is that he says how Ukrainian generals at all levels were a bit careless about building defensive positions. All they had in mind is pushing the Russians back to the border immediately. And we go back to the first mistake because they saw that they had unlimited manpower and that they could achieve this goal. And this neglect of engineering in the armed forces of Ukraine will come back in a minute. So stay tuned. Here's another interesting point. He says the Kharkiv offensive was successful. So we're talking about September 2022. Because it was not reformatted from offensive to defensive in a timely manner, we also lost our offensive potential there. That is, when we reached the area east of the Black Stallion River, which is the Zherebiets River if you look on the map, the entire power of the Ukrainian offensive stalled. And that combined with the start of the rain season just stopped the Ukrainian advance. And one of the biggest failures of the Ukrainian counteroffensive was their inability to capture the towns of Svatove and Kremina, which would have opened them the door of all of Luhansk Oblast. But once the Ukrainians got bogged down, the Russians called up their mobilized personnel and That was it. But then General Muzhenko says that the mistake of the Ukrainians was to think that they could continue this offensive instead of building fortifications and saying, okay, we're going to defend now. Overall, I think it's a very interesting look into the mindset of the Ukrainian general staff. They probably didn't want to bother about defensive positions. The Russians were on the run. They saw victory right ahead. They said, okay, we're going to continue in a couple weeks. They're going to launch another offensive in winter, and that's going to be it. In a way, they were inhaling a little bit too much of opium. Then he says that, in his opinion, the same mistake was repeated in 2024 at the beginning of the Kursk operation. He says, in the first stage, we conducted a relatively successful and well-planned operation, which had the effect of surprise, which is very difficult to achieve today. That's true. But if you read between the lines, you can see that he criticizes the Ukrainian general staff for not having a real battle plan. They probably didn't even know what they were going to do next. And we can feel it because during the Kursk operation, they were pushing in every direction, and in the end, they failed to capture most of the objectives. And he says that just like during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukrainian generals were in some sort of optimistic mood. They were inhaling too much opium. It was going too well. So they didn't bother bringing engineering units that would fortify the entire sector and make it impossible for the Russians to reconquer. And at the end of this part, he says, I think it would have been a great success if it had been a raid. In other words, penetrate Russian lines, destroy everything, capture as many prisoners as possible, and then pull back. Okay, this part is about the 2023 summer counteroffensive against the Surovikin line. He says the early information support for this counteroffensive, so the announcement to the public, created an opinion in Ukrainian society that it was simply necessary to launch it after a certain time. Having received certain weapons from our Western partners, and we would go to the shores of the Azov Sea and drink coffee on the Yalta waterfront. We all remember the NAFO ecstasy at this, what was it called? Oh yeah, the Crimea beach party or something. Muzhenko continues, these inflated expectations probably led to euphoria and disappointment in Ukrainian society regarding the true capabilities of the AFU. So on one hand, Ukraine needed to galvanize the population about reconquering the land. We all remember that infamous trailer for the counteroffensive. We remember that they announced to everyone in what direction they would attack, what was the objective. The entire operation relied on PR. But then Muzhenko says that he attended a meeting and he assessed in real time the progress of preparations for a counteroffensive. Then he asked some of the officers at the table, wait a minute, how did you assess the terrain, fortification equipment, and engineering barriers in the areas chosen for the main attacks? And he says, I can't believe it. The first time I read this, I had to literally close my laptop and go for a walk. I was like in that Pablo Escobar meme. Muzhenko said, I found out for myself that they simply did not conduct a reconnaissance. I'm still shocked. How can you be so delusional? Then he goes on to say, I doubt whether there was a general plan for the strategic counteroffensive. My friends, it's a recurring theme. It seems the AFU simply doesn't know how to coordinate military operations. At least, large-scale military operations. Muzhenko then says the issue of choosing the directions of the counteroffensive was also a mistake. How could we have chosen the directions where the Russians were already waiting for us? Those were the most fortified areas. Most importantly, the terrain was not favorable to us with elevation differences, the presence of appropriate barrier lines, and so on. Yes, what do you want me to say? And I made a lot of videos about this prior to the counteroffensive saying, you know what, maybe it's not the best idea. Maybe you should take a look at the fortifications. Maybe you shouldn't underestimate the enemy. I was just looking at all the OSINT open source intelligent information available, and I just thought it was crazy. It didn't make sense. And it turns out it didn't make sense because Muzhenko then says the opinion of the general staff was formed that Russians were not capable of fighting. The commander of the 9th Corps even told him they will just run away. Wow, this is great. And that's not all. When he went to visit that 9th Corps, he also witnessed their training. He says, I was surprised by how this counteroffensive was planned, with the classic battalion comms that we had practiced at the training grounds, tactics that they had already abandoned a long time ago. So this is how the Ukrainians plan to attack Russian lines. And if you think it cannot be worse than that, buckle up. So the offensive starts, and Muzhenko ended up talking with some of the units that participated in this attack, namely engineering units. And they admitted to him that they worked for 2 hours without any sort of cover, out in the open, just attracting Russian firepower. And it's Muzhenko that then says, hence the losses, hence the problems. That's why the Ukrainians didn't break through, and that's why they suffered heavy casualties. He even says that Ukraine's offensive potential was essentially destroyed, annihilated after the 2023 summer counteroffensive. Muzhenko also talked about the future. So he said, we need a serious conversation with society. He says from now on, everybody has to be involved in the war effort, either as a civilian working to produce military equipment or as a soldier. Everyone. But he says, so many people in Ukraine still live as if there was no war. And then, of course, he's going to talk about mobilization. He says what concerns the mobilized is primarily a matter of basic military training. In Muzhenko's mind, lowering the age limit will not solve the problem of mobilization. And in a way, it's true. We've seen that many people around that age have already left the country anyway. He says that the big problem with all these mobilized personnel is the lack of training. So since they're not properly trained, they suffer higher casualties at the front. And because of all this, there's also a higher rate of desertion. But the worst part is that I've been talking about Ukraine's problem in terms of training since 2023. It's been 2 years and it's still the same problem. In my opinion, one of the problems is simply because Ukraine puts all the best troops right at the front. And there's nobody left at the rear to train the mobilized personnel. I think it's in this article that even said that it's one trainer for 50 soldiers. He says it should be 1 for 10. Not only one instructor, yeah, it's not trainer, it's instructor. Not only one instructor for 50 recruits, but everything has to be done within a couple days. It's actually a disaster. Now, Muzhenko says Ukraine cannot use a cookie-cutter approach. He says, of course, it is tough to approach training individually, but we must understand that a category of people will learn practical skills in a month and be ready to perform tasks. Some will need 2 months. And then he says, there's some people that even if you give them 3, 4, 5 months, they still won't be ready. So he says how at the training centers, it's important to weed these people out because they will demoralize everyone and that they should be transferred to other units, for example, logistics and supplies. So in his mind, once the training of individual soldiers is better, if you add on top of this the training that they will get in the unit where they're assigned to, then there should be much fewer deserters. Because it's a big problem for Ukraine. I think we're going to talk about it in another video, but it's huge. He says the issue of psychological training should be given serious attention. He says if a person has not served in the army at all, a civilian, how can you expect that within a month and a half he's placed to a combat unit? He says what kind of soldier will he be? In what psychological state is he going to be? It's already a shock to be mobilized and to become a soldier. It's already hard to process all this information, all these emotions. And not only that, you're already sent to a combat mission within the first weeks. No wonder there's so many desertions. Everybody's shocked. Oh yeah, the first firefight, half the soldiers desert. No shit. Overall, he says there's a big problem for the training of individual soldiers. But once again, at this level, there's another problem. He says the absence of junior officers and sergeants is a major problem, which already existed before the war. And it's essentially the same problem. Since Ukraine sends all the competent military personnel at the front, because the situation is critical, there's a high rate of casualties. There's nobody that they can pull out to become an instructor, either to train the soldiers or even to train the next generation of NCOs. But I think this is a big topic that we can cover in another video. My friends, that's about it. Let me know what you thought of this article. I think it was eye-opening to me.